What's up, everybody? It's Professor Keegan back with a video for gender and popular culture. Um, we have moved into our first sort of formal analysis unit. So the first couple of units of this course, we practiced thinking about what popular culture was. We practiced reading popular culture from a couple of different intersectional perspectives, including readings of gender, sexuality, and race. I've been working on combining those skills. And in this short unit, we are looking at serial and sequential media formats, keeping everything else we've done on the table in terms of the work we've done on gaze theory, power, genre, history, patriarchy, etc. Right? So basically, we are starting out our first primary text unit, right, where we're looking at 5 major primary texts in this course. And this week, that primary text, the first one we're looking at is a comic book called Bitch Planet by DeConnick and DeLandro. So DeConnick is the author, DeLandro is the illustrator. So right away, I'd like you to think about how a comic, just like a movie or a television show or a piece of music, is the end result of a large group of people working together, often co-authoring. This doesn't even get into who lettered or inked or colored the pages in this comic book, right? So a lot of people are involved in making this piece of media, first of all. But it is a feminist comic book carrying on a tradition of feminist critique of sort of dominant cultural forms through sequential narrative. So I wanted to give you this video as early as possible this week because I'm aware that a lot of you may never have read a comic and might be thinking, what on earth do I do with this? How do I read this? What are some of the formal aspects of comics as an art form? And how does this map onto the other examples of pop culture we've looked at so far, which have mostly been cinema and music videos, right? We've been looking at moving images. This is a print medium. Okay, so I'm going to do a little introduction to how to read comics. We're going to talk about seriality and sequential media. And then I'm going to give you an exercise to work on for your discussion group. Okay, so right away, we have to note, we're starting with comics in this class because they are, one, broadly ubiquitous. They are one of the most widely consumed forms of pop culture in the world. And as I mentioned, I think last week, they're considered traditionally to be a sort of low media format, meaning they are not thought of as high literature or celebrated the way that like great works of art have been in the past. There's been an entire field of study, comic studies, that has grown up arguing that comics actually are incredibly sophisticated and do require advanced forms of reading to be able to make sense of them, right? And they include amazing artwork as well. But traditionally, they've been thought of as not a serious medium, therefore popular, right? Also, a lot of the techniques they use to convey meaning are super old when it comes to human art history. All the way back to things like Egyptian hieroglyphs, bas-relief sculpture that would tell stories in sequential pictures, right? Even the earliest kind of animated cinema is really just sequential pictures sped up fast to trick our eye so that we can't see the gaps, right? So when we think about the illustrated panel of a comic, we are looking at a really old and really essential fundamental form of cultural storytelling through images and print. One thing to note is that comics are a form of what we call serial media, meaning that they tell an ongoing story in installments. So this book is an omnibus collecting several issues of Bitch Planet together, right? And so it would come out in little instances and you would collect them and read them one by one by one. So comics are ongoing this way. They go on sometimes for decades in print runs, changing authorship, changing art style, but keeping the same characters and storylines going. You may be aware of this from becoming familiar with the MCU or Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is all based on comics, as are basically every superhero that exists in US culture now, pop culture. With it, we have a pop culture that's completely dominated by superheroes. They come from comics from the 30s, 40s, and 50s, 60s with X-Men. So ongoing story in installments is serialized media, okay, or serialized culture. They also are sequential, meaning that they're a form of storytelling that illustrates how events unfold across time. That sounds rather obvious, but not all forms of narrativity or cultural media are sequential. Not all of them tell like first this, then this, then this, right? But panels, which we'll talk about, the actual little boxes, right, that the story happens in, are illustrating for you a chronological relationship to the events on the page, right? One thing happens before another, and that's how we get the story together. A quick note that in comics, time is represented as space. So the bigger a panel is, and the wider the gutters between panels, the more time is taking place usually. If things go fast, you'll get smaller, 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 smaller panels to convey the compression of time. So when we talk about panel placement, the panels are just the squares in which the illustration is happening, right? It's broken up for reasons that make a flow, or what we call a design rhythm in comics. That placement and design, as well as the negative space between the panels, which is very important. You might not even think about that negative space, which is called a gutter between what's happening, right? But gutters tell us something is happening in between this panel and this panel, and our brains fill in that relationship. It's called closure. Okay, it's very important to understand how our brain is reading these images to create order where maybe there isn't one necessarily, right? So one thing about comics is that they're productively recursive. And what that means is that they invite you to linger and read and reread and look at the panel order, and then go back and look at the panel order and sort out what you think is happening. And they invite this process of closure between panels by placing those white negative spaces between them, into which our brains project causality, meaning, oh, this happened, and so then that happened, right? In one of my classes, I have my students all just doodle an object or a scene on index cards, completely unrelated. They don't tell each other what they're drawing. And then I have us put them all down on the table, and we can actually, just by moving them around, create a story. Because our brain fills in causality between the images people have created. And we've made some really, really funny comics this way, just from random images put together, because our brains love to create association, right? So a comic is working with that, tendency to fill in causality between moments. Okay. So we're invited to create linkages. We're invited to go back and look around the page a lot and figure out an order that makes sense. And we're also left to read at our own pace, right? Which is unlike print. Print, you read left to right, you read the words, and then you know what happened. This is a little more complicated, and a little bit more agency is left up to the reader. So time is represented as space, and the senses are represented as visual effects in comics. That should be pretty obvious, but there are some nuances here I want to talk about. One sec. So we've talked about signs or artifacts, right? There are layers of specific signs that readers of comics become familiar with, as well as styles of illustration that give text sensory meaning. So whether those are cognitive effects, linguistic effects, auditory effects, or affective and emotional effects. I'm going to give you a few examples to get you thinking about it, but I'd like you to look for the style of line around dialogue. What does that tell you? Is it being spoken out loud? Is it being only internally thought? Is it being yelled? Is something about to happen in the panel? How can you tell that? Is there an effect or a visual sign that motion is occurring, right? Things like that. So for example, here is a panel in which space equals time, right? We're in the scene with this character who's smoking the cigarette and she's walking toward the other person. So we know that not very much time at all is going by because they're having a sustained conversation. We have very narrow gutters between the panels, saying mentally we should think, oh, this is happening in a quick succession of instances, right? And the dialogue is continuing across the panels, meaning that the motion is happening as the conversation is going on, right? So this is just one example of how a comic book can create a pretty situated relationship for you in a scene, just based on telling you how fast something is happening and also telling you what's going on while it's happening, okay? And also directionality. We can imagine there's actually, because the background doesn't change, right? It's just the foregrounded figure of the woman moving. So we know she's moving around in this room. The gutters represent time passing. Nothing else has changed, and she's having this sustained conversation with this guy, Dan, right? Then there's the panel I started with, which is a panel of Captain America and Ms. Marvel fighting a bad guy, right? We can tell he's a bad guy because he's really muscly and he's a kind of nasty color and his face has this nasty expression, right? So he's coded as very villainous from the beginning. And this is an action panel. So he's also noticed that the monster they're fighting is insulting Ms. Marvel, calling her Captain America's secretary. So he's making a sexist comment about her as a female superhero. So there's already a gender kind of struggle going on here in this panel or page. Some of the things that are going on here, right? Vision equaling senses. We can see that at the top, there's motion blur as this sort of monstrous figure twists and goes to possibly punch one of these figures. So fast movement and power is being communicated by that blurriness in the frame. We also see he's got a splash color behind his dialogue, which indicates that that's the primary dialogue box to pay attention to in the scene, which means it's the loudest, right? Notice also that his speech is also in italics as well. So we're supposed to hear this as like really loud and really like angry noise because of the red conveying an angry sound. We also have him going, "Gah," right? You'll see this a lot in comics. An auditory effect that helps us understand the emotions going on or the physical relationships going on. We can assume maybe this is because Ms. Marvel is punching him in the side of the head as he's yelling, right? So he's yelled something insulting, she's punched him, and he's reacting to that. And then, right, image distortion in the lower corner here indicates conflict and disorientation, as well as this feeling of them maybe crashing into stuff around them. Maybe there's destructible objects being broken as they fight. This is a big fight. It's a really physically situated kind of feeling we get. And then we can see Ms. Marvel is powering up some kind of attack, right? That she's going to land on this enemy. And because it hasn't happened yet, but our eye is really drawn to this hand that's very highlighted in the corner, and it has primacy on the left-hand side of the screen or page, right? Because we read left to right in Western culture, so things on the left-hand side tend to be privileged. We know that probably there's something coming that she's going to do, and the next panel or page will reveal what that does and how it changes the scene. So there's a lot going on here just in terms of looking at how physicality and the senses are displayed through graphic illustration. There's also styles of line that indicate whether something is a sound or a thought. Okay, so my text box is over this, but you'll notice this is a panel from a Batman comic from the 1950s or 60s, probably 60s. And Notice that here we have speech versus thought represented. So this bad guy again, primacy in the left-hand side, is saying not only are you doomed, but also is everyone else you have touched, right? And he's got this spiky outline on his dialogue, which means he's like evil yelling. He's kind of evilly yelling. He's like doing something aggressive, right? And then you'll notice the other people in the frame are thinking. They're not speaking back. Why? How do we know that? Well, one, the little connector that would connect the text box to their head is bubbles, right? So those bubbles tell us that this is internal thought versus spoken words. And also the text box are bubbled. So anytime you see that bubble in comics, that's a convention telling you that people are thinking, not speaking out loud, which could be really lost on you if you're not used to this form. Also, this is fun for those of you who submitted your queer textual analysis, queer reading. This is a panel people love to cite for queer readings of Batman and Robin, because you can't see it, but underneath me in the screen, there are all these superheroes are like, oh no, the person I touched is going to be doomed, right? And so we have Jean Loring, I've signed her death warrant. I gave Iris West the kiss of death. Carol Ferris in deadly danger. And then you can't see what Batman's saying, but he says, Robin, what have I done? And so he has this kind of implied sort of queer relationship with his sidekick, right? That's kind of fun to read into. We also have the difference between speech and sound effects, right? So again, here we have a speech bubble coming from off panel, indicating someone is standing to this woman's right, talking at her. And then we see the emphasized sound click of the phone coming down on the receiver, right? So because that's not connected to anybody, it is a sound in the environment versus spoken. And then we also have things like balloon style and tonal or affective communication. So here we have systems rebooting, right? We see this little kind of electrical, maybe robotic look of a panel of a bubble communicating. Maybe it's a headset. This is, I think, yeah, it's Iron Man. So this is probably inside Jarvis, right? It's like Jarvis talking to him inside his helmet. And so it's a speaker doing something. And that little bubble looks a little bit like a speaker, right? Versus Iron Man's actual speech, right? Which is connected to him. Great, take your time. And then we see incoming detected in the gutter between what's happening right now and the next thing we'll see. So we know incoming detective is a transitional thing that's happening that's going to tell us something is coming, right? So look for when things overlap gutters too, because they usually are interstitial, like causality moments. It's like, here's a panel, there's a gutter, and something's happening to create the next moment in time. Okay. Now, so that's just a little bit about how to look at a comics page. If we were in person, we would be practicing a lot more together. But I gave you a secondary reading to help you understand the context of Bitch Planet, because comics traditionally were a very male form. They were for boys and young men particularly. And it took quite a long time for women artists, storytellers, and women heroes to be represented in comics, right? We still know that that's a struggle. So Bitch Planet is a really special book that's kind of clapping back at a lot of patriarchal history of representation in comics. So right off the bat, you should be aware of that. I mean, it is called Bitch Planet, right? So I had you read a little bit from Hilary Schute's book, Graphic Women, about the feminist properties of comics from this essay called Women Comics and the Risk of Representation. Really quickly, I'm going to have you work with this essay a bit in the group discussion, but I just want to point out that Shute is offering a theory of feminist aesthetics internal to graphic literature, meaning illustrated literature, right? We don't mean graphic like sensational. We mean graphic like written out, like lithography, right? So she says that like feminist comics are responding specifically to women's trauma. that this whole genre of women's comics and women's illustrated media that has kind of exploded in the past couple of decades is really concerned with trauma and illustrating the structures that create trauma for women. And so here we are with a comic that's about a women's prison, right? An off-world women's prison. How is that sort of science fiction concept connected to real things in our world that are about women's oppression, right? That's something you should be asking yourself as you read. So Shute says feminist comics, of which Bitch Planet is one. You could also say it's a queer feminist comic. How is it seeking to make structures we normally can't see visible through the use of illustration? Okay. So Shute basically says feminist graphic narratives like Bitch Planet engage in what she calls an aesthetics of testimony, meaning a certain kind of visual storytelling that's committed to making women's oppression visible in new ways. Women's oppression often falls into the gutter, right? The gutter between meaningful things. Like you think about how the male gaze and patriarchy really dominate our pop culture, and the stories of men are always considered more important generally. There's a gutter, sort of symbolic gutter created by patriarchy into which the experiences of marginalized people get pushed, right? They disappear into the background. Shute says actually what is happening in a feminist comic, and there's a long history of these, right? It wasn't too long after sort of the beginning of second wave feminism that feminists started illustrating comics to change the story of patriarchal narrativity in this form. So if you'll notice on the cover of this comic, Women's Lib comic, it collects together all these female characters like Wonder Woman and Olive Oil and Nancy that had been separated from one another in different narratives. That what would it mean to get them all together in one comic? Kind of like a dream team, like a feminist dream team. What could they achieve together? So feminism was thinking about women's organizing, and to do that, it was also thinking about how patriarchal media means that these women characters get isolated in stories run by dominant male characters, and how does that create equivalencies between the literary world and the real world, right? So this aesthetics of testimony actually is thinking through how to make women's experiences visible and audible exactly when they would normally not be visible and audible. So what are the most erased things? And then how do we create aesthetic structures to illustrate those things so that we can see them, right? I love this cover of women's comics. This is from the 1970s, and it says, except for being fat, ugly, pimple-faced, bad-tempered, and selfish, you'd think he'd see I'm a much better choice, right? So how is this about like women who don't meet the ideals of like heteronormative, white, middle class standards of, desirability? There are a bunch of women thinking through the aesthetics of that in comics. So what happens is that Shute argues that books like this are literally trying to move basically the cultural gutter, the space where things fall out of visibility, right? You could think of the little white spaces between panels as, a place where something is not seeable, that we can imply with our brain what has happened, right? Shute says that like feminist comics are like kind of trying to symbolically move the cultural gutters around so that what we typically see and hear gets changed, and other moments and types of expression come into representation, right? They reorganize aesthetically how storytelling can work. Okay, so for your discussion, I'm not going to make this any longer because you have quite a bit of reading this week. I think you'll like this book, and I want to hear from you about your thoughts. So I'm going to give you a directed prompt and then an undirected prompt. So I'd like you to do both, healthy paragraph for each. You'll notice about 2 pages into Bitch Planet, we get this very impressive double page spread, right? That's telling a really complicated story that's introducing us to an entire science fiction scenario, and this group of women that have been shipped to this prison, right? In tanks, right? In suspended animation. Um, and so what I'd like you to do, right, and I'll move this over to discussion group as well for you to have the prompt there. First, for the first half of this, I would like you to analyze this double page spread. It's only a couple of pages in, right before the title card. So we have that spread, right? And then it is setting up the title card. So it comes before the title of the book itself. So I'd like you to think about, what is it graphically doing here? Like, why is this maybe the most important way the authors choose to introduce this world to us? Why does it come even before the title, right? I would like you to use ideas and terms from class so far to analyze it. So be thinking about hooks, Mulvey, Doty, earlier readings that talked about semiotics, signs, artifacts, right? What are the relevant artifacts in this panel? And also color, panel size, gutter placement. How are people's bodies represented? What's taking up space and what isn't? And the use of dialogue boxes. How does that all go together here to sort of set up a world and a context for us that tells us a lot about gender and power, right? So I'd like you to spend some time doing some formal analysis of this spread. Once you've done that, I'd like you to kind of think more about the entire book. Where in this book do you see examples of what you think Shute is talking about moving the gutters, right? About anesthetics of testimony that makes erased experiences visible in a new way, right? Things that would normally not be included in a story that are now being introduced, right? There are a lot of really clever ways in which this book uses panels and gutters to tell really diverse stories of women's experiences. So if the first part of this is me giving you something to talk about, the second part is you grabbing something from this book that you liked, that you think is interesting, and take a picture, take a screen grab, including it and discussing it and how it fulfills what Shute is talking about this idea of testimony and telling a story that doesn't usually get seen. Okay, so that's kind of a complex journal. You have quite a while to work on it. And I hope you really like the book. I'm really looking forward to your discussion of it. And do not forget, next week, we're doing another primary text with Gone Home. So you should, at this point, have a concrete plan to get that video game onto a laptop, onto a gaming console, onto a phone, but I wouldn't recommend it. Okay. If you are encountering problems getting that piece of media, you really do need to reach out to me, because it's a main text in the course, and it's also a really awesome, fun text. So I'll leave it there. Send me any questions, and I'll look forward to reading what you come up with for this.